For this video, in order to best explain the reasoning behind the places of the raids on this list, I created a grading scale with 4 points on it: Coolness Factor, Boss Fight Uniqueness, Difficulty, and Popularity. Some people will say their favorite raid will be whichever they think is the coolest. Some will say it's whichever is the hardest. But whatever the case, I assembled the 10 best raids and assigned them points on the grading scale, based on what I think they deserve. At number 10, we've got Antorus, the Burning Throne. Coincidentally, also the most recent raid to come out as of making this video. Argus has got to be one of the coolest looking final boss fights in the game's history, and is one of the few bosses with his own theme music. Not every boss gets his own soundtrack, sadly, so this is really rare. Also, I remember watching some top guilds progress in the fight, and their raid leader had to tell them to stop oohing and awing at every new mechanic they saw, which goes a long way to show how cool people thought the fight was at first. Although, now that it's on farm for most of WoW's population, it's probably not thought of so highly right now. But I'm confident people will look back on Argus fondly, in the same way they do the Lich King and Naxxaramas for being really cool. The rest of the raid is pretty neat too, but not as stand-outish as Argus. So Antorus gets a 7 out of 10 for Coolness Factor. Most of the fights are pretty standard, with small twists to them. Sisters was wholly unique, but terrible. Ionar was a 100% ad fight that was unloved. Iminar had a neat little Frogger segment that was non-standard, but done before in other raids. Boss Fight Uniqueness, 6 out of 10. Mythic Argus was killed in the second week, and the rest of the raid was killed in the first week. Not very hard for top guilds, and moderately difficult for everyone else. Difficulty score, 5 out of 10, bog standard. The raid is well liked overall, but seeing as it's the last raid of the current tier, and featured no iconic villain save Varimathras, it will probably be forgotten, except for Argus, which kind of carries this place. Popularity score, 6 out of 10, a little bit above average. And with that, Antorus the Burning Throne comes out with a final score of 24 out of 40. Personally, I don't weigh all of the points on this list evenly. I think Boss Fight Uniqueness should have a more weighted score over all the other points. And I know a lot of people who would pick their favorite raid based on Coolness Factor alone. So, in an effort to try and be fair in a very subjective video, I'll be counting all of the scores equally. At number 9, we've got Blackrock Foundry. First up, as far as looks go, more iron and slag. Looks like it was located in the bottom of a mine. More orc aesthetic and an expansion with lots of that already. Not very cool, but not terrible either. Middle scores, so 5 out of 10 for its coolness score. Now, on to Boss Fight Uniqueness. Blackrock Foundry probably has the most unique boss fights that also were well liked in the game's history. When I created a video on the top 10 most unique boss fights, this raid took 3 spots on the list initially, but I decided to cut one of them as I didn't want half the list to be from one raid. But even then, Throgar still took the top spot. Throgar is widely considered one of the best raid fights ever made, and is wholly unique with its train dodging mechanic. And this is the big one, well liked by the WoW community. Most people hate unique fights and see them as nothing but one-time gimmicks, and also, most people love Throgar, which is basically one big gimmick fight. Hans and Franz is also a wholly unique fight where you have to play the safety dance on a moving conveyor belt while fighting 2 bosses. Gorger has a phase where you basically play Pac-Man and have to run through a maze to avoid the rolling boss of death. In addition to these very unique fights, it also has one of the best final raid bosses in the game in the form of Blackhand, which I also included in my video of the best final bosses, who, fitting in with the theme of the rest of the raid, has a very unique encounter that has you falling down and fighting in 3 different rooms for the phases of the fight. Blackrock Foundry is the benchmark for when it comes to a raid full of unique raid fights, and easily earns its 10 out of 10 ranking in this category, and is also the only raid on this list to get a full score in this category. For the raid's difficulty, not too hard, but not an easy place either. Barely above average in difficulty, 6 out of 10. And finally, its popularity score. Sadly, Blackrock Foundry is not very popular since it's a raid from Warlords of Draenor, and there is still very much a hate bandwagon for anything from that expansion. So this raid takes a huge hit to its popularity score because of that, and only gets a 4 out of 10. So with all of its scores added together, Blackrock Foundry gets a 25 out of 40. Barely one more point than Antorus, despite having a perfect score in one of its categories. Number 8. Throne of Thunder for Mist of Pandaria. Lots of people like the aesthetic for this raid, and it was commonly heralded as the next Ulduar. Personally, I thought it was pretty average, so its score of 7 out of 10 seems a little generous. Durumu the Forgotten was one of the most unique boss fights in the game's history. For that alone, it gets a nice score, but it did have a lot of varied boss fights, like Ji-kun, where you had to fly around for certain portions of the fight. So an above average score of 8 out of 10 is rightly deserved. It could probably get a higher score, but people didn't actually like the uniqueness of a lot of the fights, like Dark Animus or Primordius. And even Durumu has a lot of mixed reactions despite its wholly unique nature. This place is a good example that unique doesn't always mean good. As far as difficulty goes, it did have a hard mode only boss with a plenty difficult second to final boss in the form of Lei Shen. But nothing super hard. Pretty standard, but not easy, so 6 out of 10. Popularity. Very well liked raid, and comes up in best raids discussions all the time. When the raid first came out, lots of people were calling it the next Ulduar, due to its sheer size, scope, and feel. And while it doesn't share the same levels of popularity as Ulduar, it didn't leave people disappointed either. So a score of 7 out of 10 in popularity seems reasonable enough, more popular than the average raid. So with all of its scores added up, Throne of Thunder gets a 28 out of 40, 3 points higher than Blackrock Foundry. Turns out, having an above average score in everything gives more points than having a perfect score in one category, and average scores in everything else. Next up on this list, another Mist of Pandaria raid. Number 7 is the Siege of Orgrimar. Siege of Orgrimar literally takes place in Orgrimar, so it loses some points in its looks category for having reused assets, despite your personal opinions on how good Orgrimmar looks itself. But the fact that half the raid takes place underneath Orgrimmar with lots of unique graphics really makes up for it. I think an above average score of 7 out of 10 is fair enough. Siege of Orgrimmar has a lot of unique bosses, but none that are exceptional, like Durumu or Throgar. The very first boss is a wholly unique boss who splits up into little adds that need to be both DPS'd and healed. I can't think of any other raids that have adds that need to be healed up quickly alongside adds that need to be killed. But that's essentially just killing adds. With Galakrond, you have to fight adds on your way up to the top of the tower to shoot the dragon out of the sky, which is essentially just killing adds in awkward locations. Spoils of Pandaria is a 100% add fight with no boss to kill at the end. Siegecrafter Blackfuse takes the cake on unique in a bad way, and is one of the worst bosses in the game. I'd probably have to say Thok is the best unique boss in the place, as having a very healing intensive fight with a regular AoE interrupt is something you don't see very often, nor has it really been a thing since, on top of having a phase where raid members have to take turns kiting him around the room. Again, another example of unique in a bad way, as many healers didn't like that interrupt mechanic. Me personally, I liked it though, but I know I'm in the minority opinion about that. All that to say, as far as unique fights go, it gets a 7 out of 10. Difficulty. I'd have to say that Mythic Garrosh was probably the most fairly balanced and well-designed final bosses I've ever had the pleasure of trying. It's hard, with a lot of personal responsibility, but it also lacks BS raid wipe mechanics. Like, one person messing up their job could wipe the raid, but it really felt like, yep, that one person missed their interrupt on the mind control, and not as frustrating as, say, Mythic Kil'jaeden placing Illidan in a weird spot during the night phase. But overall, Mythic Garrosh won't win any awards for being one of the hardest bosses of all time. Mythic Siegecrafter Blackfuse, on the other hand, that fight has lots of mixed opinions on it. I personally hated the fight so much I created the top 10 worst raid bosses video just to put him at number 1, while other people love it and hail it as one of the best designed bosses of all time. But whatever the case, everyone does agree that the fight was hard as any final boss in a raid even, which really brings up its difficulty score to an 8 out of 10. And finally, popularity. Siege of Orgrimar is well liked and brought up in best raids of all time discussions, but not as much as some of the final raids on this list, so I give it an above average score of 7 out of 10. So with all of its scores added up, Siege of Orgrimar has a total score of 29 out of 40, only 1 point higher than Throne of Thunder. So overall, Mists of Pandaria had some really good raids. Number 6, the Nighthold from Legion. The Nighthold is a very cool looking raid and beautiful. Even its sewer system was clean for the most part. Although we do later fight a boss who explains why that is the case. But a majority of the raid is just reused assets from the Zone of Siramar. Although, the Zone of Siramar was basically created with this raid in mind, and the final fight has to be one of the coolest looking fights. Legion really hit out of the park when it came to cool looking boss fights, and Gul'dan opening a portal to Argus halfway through the fight and having a badass end of fight cinematic where Illidan just straight murders him. All in all, 8 out of 10. I did have to dock some points for it basically being just an extension of Siramar, but it was still very impressive despite that. As for boss uniqueness, it was okay, but didn't have anything spectacular. Elisande has a unique mechanic where you had to kill her like 3 times because she kept rewinding time whenever you brought her health down too low. But that was still basically just killing the same boss over and over, only with more mechanics added each time. And everything else was pretty standard. It's pretty average as far as uniqueness goes, so 6 out of 10. Now for difficulty. The Nighthold came out at a weird time for the player base in Legion. It was the last raid of the first tier of Legion to come out, and Legion was experimenting with new gear systems and a new way to acquire raid level gear. Legendaries were completely luck based when it came to getting them, and super crucial to many specs rotations. Artifact power was one of the biggest grinds in the game's history, and the early parts of Legions had it the worst. Also, Titan Forged heroic gear could be the same item level or better than mythic gear, so split running became very prevalent amongst all top guilds. With so many different grinds that all took a long time, more guilds than ever stopped raiding after finishing Nighthold. It was just too much, and nearly all of them burned out, so it was hard to gauge how tough the raid itself was when you have all of this background information to take in as well, which directly relates to the raid. It's not like Nighthold was easy. Star Augur, Elisande, and Gul'dan gave top guilds a hard time, but ultimately the world first Gul'dan kill was achieved 2 weeks after it was available. That's not to say the raid was a pushover either. Modern raids are harder than ever. The average player-based skill level just increases over time. But due to just the sheer amount of guilds who quit after or during Nighthold, even if it wasn't really the raid's fault in of itself, I think justifies an 8 out of 10 rating in difficulty, although it could easily be debated to be a lower number. Now for Nighthold's popularity. 8 out of 10. Pretty popular place and fondly looked back on, which is rare for not how far away it was. Usually people don't look back fondly on raids unless there's an expansion or two in between them. But Nighthold is universally loved, despite the state of the game during its time as current content. And to tally up the numbers, Nighthold gets a respectable 30 out of 40 total. Number 5, Karazhan from the Burning Crusade. Karazhan has an amazing look and feel to the place, has lots of rich lore background, and has an iconic soundtrack. I doubt too many people disagree with giving Karazhan a perfect score in the coolness category, so 10 out of 10. Boss fight uniqueness. Well, the Karazhan chess event was a one-of-a-kind boss fight, but considering the time period the place came out in, Blizzard was still in its early stage of developing boss fights, so nothing too crazy. Outside of the chess event, of course, so 6 out of 10. It did have one wholly unique fight, but that's about it. As Karazhan was an opener raid for TBC, it was not at all very difficult, and meant as the place to gear up before going into the other raids. So, average difficulty of 5 out of 10 is appropriate. And as far as popularity, Karazhan is super popular. It's regularly heralded as one of the best raids of all time, basically just for its coolness factor alone. Hell, Blizzard even remade it as a mythic dungeon in Legion, and they managed to make it even cooler than the original. I would give it a full score in popularity, but I think that should be held for the real most popular raid of all time. So, a 9 out of 10 is good enough. So with all of Karazhan's scores added up, it gets a 30 out of 40 total, tied with the Nighthold. Karazhan is an excellent example of how a raid doesn't need to have any particularly special and varied boss fights, nor great difficulty, to be heralded as one of the best raids. Sometimes, just the look and feel of the place is more than enough for people. Number 4, Naxxaramas from Vanilla WoW and Wrath of the Lich King. Naxxaramas is a floating necropolis with 4 varied wings, all with different themes and designs. An above average looking design for sure, so 7 out of 10 for coolness factor. Lots of unique bosses, some so unique they were never used again. Vanilla 4 Horsemen was the only boss fight that required 8 tanks. 8 warrior tanks specifically, with a 2-set bonus from one of the previous raid tiers so they could taunt properly. Plus Lotheb was unique, Thaddeus was unique, the safety dance was unique, having to mind control a boss. Nax was a unique boss extravaganza. 8 out of 10. Difficulty, 9 out of 10. 4 Horsemen Vanilla Nax is one of the hardest raid fights ever made, and made it into my top 10 list on the hardest raid bosses of all time. The other bosses weren't to push over either. Vanilla Nax was so hard, most players never completed it, and is a big reason why they re-released the raid in Wrath, so that everyone could get a chance to actually experience it. Popularity. Blizzard liked Nax so much, they put it in the game twice, and is the only raid in game to make 2 appearances as a raid. Karazhan made a reappearance as well, but as a dungeon. But as far as the WoW community as a whole, I'd say they liked it well enough, but it's definitely overshadowed by the other much more popular raids. So it gets a slightly above average score of 7 out of 10. So with all the scores added up, Nax gets a 31 out of 40. Surprisingly, beating out a lot more iconic raids. When I originally made this list, Nax didn't even make my top 10. But after gauging my community by asking them about their favorite raids on Twitter and Discord, Nax came up a lot. So I decided to add it to the number 10 spot. Then, after assigning all the raid scores based on my grading system, the list shifted around a bit, with Nax having the most dramatic shift, moving from the number 10 spot all the way down to number 4, which surprised me, but makes sense when you look at its score. It's decently above average in popularity, looks, and feel, plus its boss fights were hard and unique. It fits very well into the grading system I created, and a raid not even in the rough draft of the video ended up at the number 4 spot. So, good job, Nax. Number 3, the Firelands from Cataclysm. The Firelands is a cool and unique zone. I think it's even wholly unique, but they might have used some of the assets for the Molten Front dailies as well. I never actually did those, so I'm not 100% sure. Whatever the case, 8 out of 10. Uniqueness. Lord Rylith and Alice Razor were unique fights. Lord Rylith had you attack his feet to steer him around to step on volcanoes. Alice Razor had DPS players play Star Fox and fly through flame rings to get a buff. Although, people hated Rylith, and there were mixed feelings about Alice Razor. So, 7 out of 10 for boss fight uniqueness. Now as for difficulty in Firelands, Ragnaros Heroic was considered, for a time, one of the hardest and longest raid fights to date. I don't actually know if another boss fight has a longer fight than Heroic Rag, which clocked in at around 16 minutes long. And even though the fight was difficult, it was very well liked, which is not something you hear very often. People usually hate fights if they're too hard, except Ragnaros. So for having a boss that appeared on my top 10 hardest raid bosses list, I give Firelands a 9 out of 10 in difficulty. Popularity. Firelands enjoys an above average amount of popularity, as many people consider it the best raid from Cataclysm, and it was very well liked during its time. Easy 8 out of 10. Adding up the scores, Firelands gets a 32 out of 40. Just high marks all around, a very popular, well-liked raid with a handful of interesting bosses, plus one of the best end bosses. Number 2, Icecrown Citadel from Wrath of the Lich King. Coolness. ICC gets a 10 out of 10. Blizzard went all out with this place, and it was fitting, seeing as it housed Warcraft's most popular villain ever, the Lich King. There was tons of lore surrounding the place, the structure is completely unique, and the look and feel really sells the very cold place of undeath. I doubt anyone would argue about ICC getting a perfect score in this category. If anything, ICC could be used as the poster boy for what a 10 out of 10 in this category should be like. Boss fight uniqueness. ICC isn't really known for its unique boss fights, but it has them anyway. Velythria Dreamwalker was the first raid boss in the game that involved healers having to heal a boss to beat the encounter. A first unique idea that was eventually replicated in other bosses later on in WoW in some form or another. It was a unique mechanic that people liked, which is rare for new unique mechanics. And then, on the flip end, we have Sindragosa, who had a unique mechanic that punished players for attacking too much, which people hated, and was rarely used again. The gunship battle was one of a kind too, in that you had to get in cannons to down the enemy ship. It essentially boiled down to a glorified ad fight, but it was easy, and is one of the easiest raid encounters of all time. Blood Queen and Putris also had unique mechanics, but not on the same scale as Velythria. So ICC was an above average raid when it came to unique mechanics, with one wholly unique raid boss, and gets an 8 out of 10 for that. Difficulty. The Lich King also makes an appearance on my list of the hardest raid bosses of all time. It wasn't down until the stacking buff came out, but at the same time, Heroic ICC had this mechanic of limited attempts in place, which artificially increased its difficulty. You see, Blizzard was trying out this mechanic where you could only have 50 tries on each boss of a heroic raid for the week. Once you hit 50 attempts, you were locked out from trying that boss until next week. This was to prevent top guilds from just wiping on the boss non-stop, until they eventually downed it. But it didn't. Instead, what top guilds did was do attempts on their alts first, and then hop on their mains for real attempts. And since the mechanic just promoted top guilds to have a fully geared army of alts, Blizzard scrapped the mechanic the next tier, and it was only a thing for 2 raids. But because of these limited attempts, the raid might have seemed a lot harder than it really should have been. Plus, Sindragosa is infamous for being annoyingly difficult.
Suffer, mortals, as your pathetic magic betrays you!
So, a 9 out of 10 for difficulty seems appropriate. Now on to popularity. Easy 10 out of 10, there's no question about that. ICC is one of, if not the, most popular raid in the game's history. It was very well loved by everyone, and often considered the second best raid in the game's history. But not the first best. We'll get to that in a second though. Now to tally up the scores, ICC gets a 37 out of 40 total score. ICC sufficiently looks cool, has good bosses, and was plenty difficult to pose a challenge to even top raiders, something that isn't seen very often, and it deserves its popularity. Now, on to the number 1 raid. Number 1, Ulduar from Wrath of the Lich King. Ulduar takes place in an underground Titan facility, which also has an above ground Titan facility at the start, and ends in a pit of insanity with the fight against Yogg-Saron. Yogg-Saron himself is also an incredibly cool boss who was well loved by the community, being the second and last old god we've fought in games so far. Algalon has probably one of the coolest boss designs in story. The 4 keepers' rooms are all diverse and unique. The whole place is great. Some would even say, perfect. I give Ulduar a 10 out of 10 in coolness, but I personally prefer ICC's aesthetic and feel to Ulduar. But that doesn't mean Ulduar doesn't deserve a perfect score in this category nonetheless. Boss fight Uniqueness. Yogg-Saron was a wholly unique fight. Having to watch your insanity, using keepers to help, and having to go into the brain room to damage him. Also, there's the hard mode triggers. Ulduar was the first ever raid to have an extensive amount of hard mode versions of fights. 10 of the 14 bosses had hard modes, only you didn't flip a switch to get the hard mode versions, and instead had to do the fight in a special way to activate hard mode. And if you completed a fight on its hard mode, you got better gear, and unlocked the ability to fight Algalon, who would then only be available for a limited time. Hard mode triggers were a success from a game design point of view, and is partly the reason we have different modes to raids to this day. It used to be, before Ulduar, there was only one difficulty for every raid, and only a handful of bosses with hard mode triggers. Once Blizzard saw that people liked the extensive amount of hard mode triggers, they introduced heroic mode in the very next raid, which was eventually morphed into the mythic mode we have today. So, all that to say, 8 out of 10 when it comes to fight uniqueness. It may have had a successful mechanic that inspired modern raiding, but it ain't no Blackrock Foundry when it comes to unique raid fights either. I think an 8 is more than generous. Difficulty. Yogg-0, that is, Yogg-Saron without any of the keepers helping, was considered impossible to complete during its time, before the Chinese Guild Stars managed to do it thanks to a complicated kiting pattern. Firefighter, the hard mode trigger for Mimiron, is also considered one of the hardest raid fights. Algalon, the limited spawn boss, was no pushover either, but really got overshadowed by the monsters that were Yogg-0 and Firefighter. Plus, one other hard mode trigger that got nerfed for being too hard. A raid with 2 of the hardest raid bosses, with one of them thought to be impossible because it was so hard, I think Ulduar deserves a 10 out of 10 when it comes to difficulty. Now for popularity. Ulduar is considered the benchmark for a good raid. Whenever a new raid comes out that people like, it will be hailed as the next Ulduar. Or, sure, X raid was good, but was it Ulduar good? A raid that is considered the benchmark of good raids is very popular, and easily gets a 10 out of 10 in popularity. While writing this video, I asked on my Twitter and Discord which raid they thought was better, ICC or Ulduar. A vast majority in both situations said it was Ulduar hands down. But that ICC was good too. Just like, you know, not Ulduar good. Now, to tally up the scores. Ulduar is the only raid on this list to get a perfect score in 3 categories, and ends up with a 38 out of 40. It's funny how the 2 best raids were both in Wrath. It's no wonder Wrath was the golden age of WoW's popularity. Okay, and that's the end of the video. The way I presented this video was kind of in a unique style, in that I just talked about the scores each raid got and the grading scale I made up. For the type of video this is, I couldn't really think of another way to do the video that wasn't just me spouting my personal feelings about each raid. And this was an attempt to make the video seem more objective. So my question for you guys, did you like the way this video was done? Did the way I do it give more weight to the places of the raids on the list, or was it just annoying? I'm interested to hear your feedback on it. In addition, to you calling me dumb for excluding X Raid.